30 minutes later, Ludmilla slouched in a daze on the wagon. More so than any work she had done during the day so far, the half-hour with Count Vulkanheim had been stressful and draining. "Say, my lady," she asked tiredly, "was Count Vulkanheim using some sort of ability?" Lady Schultier, who had assumed her seat beside her, shrugged. "Who knows, I didn't feel anything." "You said mind-affecting abilities have no effect on you, did you not?" The vampire shrugged again, and Ludmilla groaned. "Fine, whatever." She tried to perk herself back up, turning to the elder lich. "Who do we have next?" "Baron Victor Bayren de Lardoin, Guest House 23. Lady Schultier." Ludmilla began tentatively. "Yes? Maybe I should just go with Lutzi for the next one. Did I just hear wait in the wagon?" 30 minutes, my lady." Ludmilla complained. "It took 30 minutes to get what we needed out of that overeager RRGH. Lady Corlin only took 5. It had all started innocuously enough. Lord Vulkanheim had been all courtesy and smiles, eager to listen to what their request was. Except he kept trying to invite them in for tea, or lunch, or to gaze upon the beauty of the gardens or discuss the future. The young man was around the age of Ludmilla's brothers, so she had expected maybe something, but her patience quickly wore thin. He wouldn't take his eyes off of Lady Schultier, all the while constantly fixing his posture, straightening his clothing or trying to pat down an imagined tuft of unruly hair that wasn't actually there, which had the effect of further undoing the efforts of his hurried grooming with every attempt. Whenever any of Ludmilla's questions finally got through to him, he wouldn't turn to respond, he would simply speak as he gazed at Lady Schultier, spewing forth copious amounts of archaic, flowery language while listing addresses and names in an effort to impress his eloquence upon her. Lady Schultier simply smiled, leaving Ludmilla to do all the talking as she observed the exchange. It had become infuriating to the point that she itched to reach out with both of her arms and twist his head over to actually look at the person with whom he was conversing with. She held back, as a baron could hardly raise their hand against a count, but, in that moment, she thought if there was ever a reason to advance in court politics, it would be to gain the authority to act against those that had taken leave of their senses. In the end, she had mentally limped away from Vulkanheim's residence, with his valet André looking on apologetically. "At this rate," Ludmilla muttered darkly, "we will not be done collecting contacts until tomorrow evening. Your appearance is simply too dazzling, Lady Schultier." "I could change forms," she offered. "I'm nice and calm again, but all I'd need is a little bit of blood to help me set things off." They would collapse before answering anything. "Then how about I just dominate them?" "Using magic to procure statements is treated as collecting information under duress, my lady," Ludmilla said. "It is illegal under the Crown laws and a violation of common regional conventions." "I broke a law of the Sorceress Kingdom back in the civil office?" Lady Schultier turned her head to look up at Ludmilla. "I said what I was going to say anyways, my lady, so I will not press charges." "Well, it's a silly human law anyways," Lady Schultier sniffed dismissively. "We should have it changed." Ludmilla looked over at Lady Schultier incredulously. She had drawn her fan from somewhere and now held it open in front of her face with a coquettish look in her eyes. "No," Ludmilla said flatly. "People will think that you are flirting with them if you do that." "Well, maybe if you drop the look it might work." The crimson eyes behind the fan seemed to droop a bit. "We should move on to the next manor," Ludmilla ordered the Soul Eater to their next destination. "Count Vulkanheim has taken up too much of our valuable time." Fortunately, Baron Ardoin had not turned out to be the next Count Vulkanheim. Perhaps he would have, if he hadn't been 12 years old, and they were able to get some of the information that they needed in a few minutes after he had been coaxed to open his door to speak to them. By the middle of the afternoon, they had visited all of the nobles that were currently residing in the city, and Ludmilla looked over the long list of names and addresses, trying to determine their best prospects. Countess Jesn was particularly helpful, pointing out a couple of especially hard-headed lumber merchants. Ludmilla thought to start there as they rolled out of the administrative district while she munched on the sandwich Amelia had handed to her for the short trip. The food had been left for so long that the sauce Terra made soaked into one side of the bread, which just so happened to suit her tastes. As the wagon slowly trundled through the city streets, she spotted a few onlookers peeking out of their windows at the noise before they vanished at the sight of the undead in their entourage. The roads were still empty of citizens, but it was more life than she had seen on the main streets the evening before. The thoroughfares of the common area, while paved, were rougher than the well-maintained cobblestone pavement of the central district, so the long freight wagon occasionally bounced and stuttered as it ran over the cracks and holes in the street. A few eldritches flew by overhead, looking down at the noise of the wagon. They were nearly indistinguishable in appearance from her attaché, so she wondered whether it could fly as well. It wasn't until she looked down at its feet that she realized it had been quietly floating alongside the entire time as it took notes in its leather tome. The footmen following after the wagon continued their heavy tread, and she could hear Amelia in the back of the wagon continuing in her efforts to converse with the vampire brides. Once Ludmilla completed her meal and put away the basket, she turned to Lady Sheltier to speak. "My lady, does the Sorceress Kingdom have any ships?" she asked. Maybe," Lady Sheltier said. "I'd have to check back home. The underground lake should have a few, but I'm not sure if we can lend those to anyone." "Why do you ask?" Ludmilla had no idea where the underground lake was, but explained her situation anyways. "Have you tried searching for it?" Lady Sheltier asked after listening to her issue. "If it's a ship, it should still be somewhere along the river, shouldn't it?" "The land route from Wardensvale to the Western Highway doesn't follow the river," Ludmilla said, "so we did not have the opportunity to look for it on the way here. I can send a few members of my household to check the river while you try to find merchants for your goods," Lady Sheltier offered. "I would greatly appreciate the assistance, my lady." A small swarm of black bats appeared from the shadows on the road, chittering and fluttering over their heads. "What does this boat look like?" Lady Sheltier asked. "A ship with a single sail," Ludmilla said. "As far as I know, it is the only large vessel that operates on the river." Upon hearing her rough description, the bats veered southwards and disappeared over the shingled rooftops of the city. The Solita continued driving the wagon down the gentle incline of the main streets as they rode further from the city center. Eventually, the road opened up into the main plaza, which was the largest of the open spaces that dotted the city and the closest one to the gate of the administrative district. To their right was a cathedral and, to the north of it, the Adventurer Guild. Both buildings appeared to be open, as opposed to the many others bordering the plaza with their shuttered windows and sealed doors. She did not see any adventurers in front of the guild, nor did there appear to be anyone around the cathedral. Looking at it, she was reminded of Bohadan, who had led the villagers south into the theocracy. She wondered how they were faring in the foreign land, and how she might be able to have them return now that it seemed that their flight had been a needless one. The wagon continued following the street, crossing between the large fountain in front of the temple and a tall column which dominated the plaza. Street lamps were set apart evenly around the square, and Ludmilla noticed many conspicuously open spaces where market stalls of various sizes should have been. The empty state of the city plaza seemed especially lonely, now that she knew that the buildings all around were most likely fully occupied, their tenants too fearful to leave their homes. The Solita turned after passing the fountain, cutting across to where the street left the plaza from its southwest corner. They traveled several more blocks until the wagon turned into an alley to stop beside one of the branches of the Merchant Guild. The building looked no more promising than those around it. The windows on the main floor were not simply shuttered like the ones on the second and third floors, but boarded in an effort to prevent the looting that often accompanied a hostile occupation. The hollow in which the door stood was shadowed and unwelcoming. "I don't hear anyone inside," Lady Sheltier noted. "You can hear inside this locked-up building?" Ludmilla looked at her. "Yes. I don't have any specific skills in search or detection, but I do have keen senses, especially when it comes to certain sense and hearing in general. How are you not driven to distraction listening to thousands of people all around you in any given part of the city?" "The same as anyone else, perhaps," Lady Sheltier shrugged. "Do you have trouble with your perception when you are in a crowded street? Let's keep going." They made several more stops, finding those buildings unresponsive or empty as well, before finally reaching an address that appeared to be occupied. It was the home of one of the merchants that Countess Jesn had noted was especially hard-headed. When the Solita stopped in the alley beside the Wattle and Daub house, she saw that there was a gate that looked to be an entrance to a large lumberyard. Ludmilla peered between the bars of the gate. Beyond, it looked like the yard had been mostly emptied. There was a man walking around the few remaining piles of timber with a board in hand. Ludmilla stepped down and went to stand outside the gate, but couldn't see any chain to pull or bell to ring. She rattled the gate to get his attention, but either he was too far to hear, or too hard of hearing to notice. She finally resorted to using her newly learned ability. Gareth voice. She spoke at a normal volume, but the man jumped with a startled shout anyways, looking all about him for the source of the voice. For some reason, the gate where they stood was the last place he turned to. He hobbled forward, scratching his head. He was perhaps in his 50s, with leathery sun-baked skin over his tall and wiry form. His skinny neck, sharp nose and nest of unruly and fading red hair made Ludmilla think of a woodpecker. He peered through the gate at the women assembled on the other side. "This is a lumberyard," he called out far too loudly for the short distance between them, "not a boutique." "I would not have called you by name if I did not know where I was," Ludmilla replied. "Fair enough, miss," the man conceded. "What can I do for you?" "As you may have noticed, there's not much to buy here. The Royal Army bought up most of it during the winter. Not that it did them any good." "What do you have left in inventory?" "The expensive stuff, mostly," he immediately replied. "The army took all the cheap timber for firewood. There were some things that needed fixing in the military district as well when they came in at first." Ludmilla winced. Most of the timber that had been chosen for delivery to the capital from Warden's Vale were luxury goods that usually fetched a high price. There was no helping it, however. "I've brought a wagon with several tons of timber to sell," she said as he continued to stand across the gate from them. "Countess Jesn recommended you to me as someone that would continue to operate even with the city as it is right now." "Countess Jesn? Her boy is gone then. That's a damn shame." That old harpy was right though, up to a point. The gate rattled as he stepped forward to unlock the heavy padlock holding the gate chain shut. "Can't do any business with an empty yard." The last of the links slid off with a clatter, and Gareth pulled the gate open after hanging up the chains. He dusted his hands off as he stepped into the alley. "All right then," he said, "let's see what you have." Ludmilla waved her hand to the solitaire at the entrance of the alley, and it brought the wagon forward. "My driver is bringing the wagon in," she warned Gareth. "You may want to step out of the way." The solitaire deftly brought the long wagon into the dusty lumber yard from the narrow alley, making a small loop to face the gate. Gareth backed away wide-eyed as it did so, hurriedly stepping well out of its path. Amelia and the vampire brides hopped off of the back of the wagon after it stopped. The two Death Knights stayed to stand watch at the entrance of the alley to the street, and Ludmilla did not see the Elder Lich anywhere until she looked up and saw that it had flown high above them. The ghostly figure of an imp sat on a portion of the fence a few paces away, intently looking down at her. Ludmilla leafed through her folder, locating the page listing the timber inventories that had been transported to the city. She stepped over to the owner of the lumberyard, who was still standing a short distance away in the alley. "This should be everything related to your business," Ludmilla proffered the sheet of paper. "Let us know what you can offer for it." Gareth absently took the sheet and looked down to read it. As his eyes scanned over the inventory, his brows furrowed as he turned his head back up to look at the wagon. The man hobbled back into the lumberyard, circling around the wagon to look inside. His pace slowed somewhat when he encountered Amelia and the vampire brides. After a moment he shook his head, muttering something unintelligible as he pulled himself up into the back of the wagon. They watched him work from the ground behind the wagon. He slowly tracked over the wagon bed, occasionally leaning over to run his hand over the tree trunks or kneel to inspect their cross-sections. When he reached the front of the wagon, he stopped to look over two trees that appeared to have been kept whole. He leaned over to rub his hand over one of the smaller branches, bringing his palm up to his face. He shook his head once again while muttering to himself. Ludmilla took a step back to give Gareth room to come down from the wagon, looking at him expectantly. "Where do you come from, young miss?" The lumber merchant kept his eyes on the inventory sheet, running them down the list again. "Zaradnik Barony," she replied simply. "So that's where that bastard got his stock." Gareth was half muttering again, then noticed the questioning looks he was getting. "You came with Jesn's recommendation, so I figured you for the daughter of some magnate from her territory learning the family trade. We haven't gotten any new timber all winter, and the merchant inventories are all dried up." The merchant pulled a stick of charcoal out from behind his ear and started to scribble on the paper. Anyways, he didn't look up as he wrote, "There's another guy in the guild who always turned up with all the expensive stuff like you have here. kept it all hush-hush. He was pretty proud that he could produce wood that no one else was able to. We all thought he was undergoing some reckless operation. All of the timber you have in your wagon doesn't grow around Rantle. It doesn't? Ludmilla was familiar with her own territory, but wasn't sure of other places in the duchy. Nope, he said, too wet, or not warm enough. Jesn County exports a lot of timber, but it's the type used for regular construction, mostly. Everything here should be from the southern slopes of the border ranges or even further. That's why we thought he was doing something risky, hiring adventurers and the like to guide his teams while they harvested in demi-human-infested lands. Turns out that he probably got it from you folks. Where is this merchant now? Gone. He got pretty rich trading this for years on top of all of his other business. We all thought he was including the overhead for everything needed to safely get this inventory, but seems like it was pure profit for him. He pulled up his roots and moved to some nice city in the north of the empire to retire with his family before the winter. I see, so what is it actually worth? Ludmilla was sure she wouldn't like where this seemed to be leading. Gareth finished writing on the inventory sheet, and handed it back to her. Like I was saying before, he said, the army cleaned out all the cheap lumber to use, so I need to restock on that for whenever business picks up again. You don't have any here, though. You have a lot of rosewood, but that ain't what we need now. It's used for good furniture, expensive paneling and fixtures, fancy doors, windows, railings and the like. Carvings, perfumes and instruments as well. I can take it off your hands, but I can't give you last year's prices for it. It'll take a long time to use it all up with the way things are, or maybe I'll have to find a buyer for it elsewhere, if caravans will even come to the city anymore. Ludmilla couldn't help but frown. The rosewood logs were 2/3 of her timber. You'll have a shortage of it soon, I think. Lady Shiltier spoke from beside her. Oh? And who might you be, young miss? Gareth folded his arms over his chest. Ludmilla wasn't sure what results the man's casual attitude would produce, so she interjected on her behalf quickly. Lady Shiltier is a close confidant of the king, she told him. I have not heard anything about this though. What did you mean by this, my lady? Close confidant. Lady Shiltier repeated the words, her expression turned strangely loose. After a moment, she realized that there were others watching her and she straightened her face, clearing her throat lightly. The section of the city containing the slums has been cleared out and cordoned off, by order of the Guardian Overseer. It's being torn down as we speak. Why would she do that? Ludmilla had a worried expression. Thousands of people live in that part of the city, where will they go? Because it is a monument to failure, Lady Shiltier spoke sternly. Or at least that's how the Guardian Overseer described it. Its very existence is offensive, a mark of shame against those of the previous administration. The leaders of this city were charged with its management, and the fact that such a construct had manifested is proof of their failure at doing so in a fully productive manner. Pending certain results, the displaced population will be relocated to the rural regions to work the lands to the northeast that have been abandoned in the past year. For the time being, they are being housed in other parts of the city and provided for. That's big talk, lady. Gareth's voice was grim as he digested her words. I'm no great lord, but from where I stand, that's something not even Lord Rettenmuir could do with the old king's support. So what does this have to do with the shortage you're talking about? You all plan on building something? That's right. If Lady Shiltier took offense to the merchant's attitude, it did not show. The entire city quarter is to be repurposed into an area for demi-humans, and it will be fashioned in such a way that those with various needs not provided by human accommodations can live there comfortably. You will not want for demand in the near future. Gareth was silent as he considered her words, shifting slightly on his feet. When he looked to have made up his mind, he turned and looked about to spit on the ground, but decided against it in the presence of all the women. Fine, he said. If your tip turns out, it'll be busier than I've ever seen in my life. I'll have to let the guild know as well. There's no way I can keep up with just my yard. Then the rosewood, Ludmilla said tentatively. Last year's prices, Gareth told her. It's still a lot to use up. We're going to need a lot more of the timber that's needed for construction, if you'll let Countess Jesn know. The ironwood I'll gladly take as well. The army took that to use for their weapons. I won't take the sandalwood though, that'd be a waste. You're better off selling it elsewhere. Where should I go with it? Ludmilla was barely keeping up with the change in direction. Do you know anyone that would buy it? Gareth snorted derisively. If they're as old as they look, the alchemists and the jewelers will be fighting each other over who gets to buy it. So, do we have a deal? This is fine, I think. Though the prices that he offered were attractive, Ludmilla wasn't really certain whether they were correct or not. However, she didn't think she had much of a choice with the city as it was. Good, I hate haggling. Gareth turned and shouted in the direction of his home, boy. His voice echoed off the alley wall, carrying over the roofs nearby. Boy, goddamn! Half a man and he's still jumping at shadows. I'll be back with my seal. Gareth limped off in the direction of his house. Boy. There's some pretty girls in the yard waiting for you. With a loud bang, the back door of Gareth's house slammed shut behind him. While the lumber merchant was away in his house, Ludmilla directed one of her footmen to unload the wagon, arranging the rosewood and ironwood logs into separate piles. As Gareth's muffled shouts continued to sound from within his home, she held up the sheet that he had handed back to her. She had struggled to maintain a neutral expression after seeing the merchant's revised quote. She wasn't sure if she was successful in the attempt, but now her expression went from anger to whimsy and back again. That's an interesting show you're putting on there, Lady Shiltier noted. I honestly can't tell if you're pleased or displeased. I'm satisfied with Mr. Boyce's offer, my lady, Ludmilla explained, but the value of the timber has connotations that make me furious. If that's you being furious, I think I was right about you transforming into a golem. I will not act inappropriately in public, Ludmilla sighed, but I really do want to strangle this merchant my family has been dealing with all these years. Lady Shiltier turned to look up at her, head tilted curiously. That sounds more like something that I should be doing. The chime in her voice was at odds with the violent nature of her quip. What is it that drives the very picture of human composure to such anger? These numbers here represent last year's market prices. She turned her inventory sheet turned invoice towards the inquisitive vampire. They are 7 times higher than what we were offered by the merchant last year for the same timber. It seems that you were cheated, Lady Shiltier said. Yes. Well, no. Not exactly. Ludmilla quickly corrected herself. Mr. Boyce said that this merchant included the costs of an adventurer escort and labor, presumably to keep up the image that it was his own venture and he was shouldering all of the risk. A party of adventurers powerful enough to force their way through the southern wilderness and maintain a safe environment for this sort of operation should be at least mithril rank. The cost of having a party of mithril rank escorts for weeks at a time was assumed to be a part of the market price listed here. Lady Shiltier stared blankly at Ludmilla's words. Ludmilla attempted to expand on them, and in doing so she became increasingly annoyed. There was little risk for this merchant, she said. Minimal investment with no venture. Like Mr. Boyce said, it was pure profit for him and he had us all dancing to his tune. It is a surprise that no one in the Merchant Guild even checked with the Adventurer Guild to see if there was actually a mithril-ranked adventurer team holding such long contracts. He saw an opportunity and gambled on the hope that no one would catch on to his scheme, and he won. I can't even blame him, even though I feel like it. We all willingly accepted his business without question, so in the end we cheated ourselves. I have been helping out with domain business for several years now, and this possibility only occurred to me after Mr. Boyce essentially wrote it down and handed it over. I am just as guilty of this same oversight that has been plaguing my house. How long have you been dealing with this merchant? Lady Shiltier asked. That's the worst part. My father had been doing business with this man since before I was born. She felt her voice taking on a tinge of anger. This has probably been going on for generations. Generations? Was this merchant an elf? No, that's not what I meant, Ludmilla said. It has to do with these market prices. Look at the numbers. I don't know how you value things around here. Is it that much more than it should be? That is a colossal understatement. Ludmilla wanted to laugh ruefully. Wardensvale would be at least a large town supporting dozens of villages throughout the barony if we had these prices for the last century. We would have been able to grow so quickly, developing more land and expanding our holdings. Even if the other frontier nobles had lost their fiefs, we could have simply fortified the entire border on our own with the growth that these numbers represent. Well, that is perhaps slightly optimistic, but with that length of time, House Zaradnik might have been as prosperous as the nobility of the interior. Instead, we simply scraped by in our ignorance for generations, content with our simple lives when we could have been performing our duties so much more effectively. The way you put it, it really does sound miserable, Lady Shultier said. You're sure you don't want revenge on this merchant? I could help you hunt him down, and we can make him suffer slowly for his wrongdoings. It would be quite satisfying, yes? Amelia, who had come to see what her mistress fuming was about, nodded energetically to her side. I agree. I can't believe such good people could have this happen to them. She balled up her fist and held it up with a fierce expression. We should find him and get payback. This time Ludmilla did laugh, albeit softly. The image of her unexpectedly vicious lady's maid who was deathly afraid of the undead teaming up with a powerful vampire was too ridiculous. No, Ludmilla shook her head. It is not worth pursuing now, and he is only one of many merchants that probably took advantage of our blind trust. Now that I know, I will figure out how to prevent this in the future. I can only move forward now and work on transforming Warden's Vale into what it was always meant to be. After the words passed from her lips, Ludmilla felt embarrassment creep up her neck at how she must have sounded, considering she had yet to really do anything herself. However, Lady Shultier gave her a look of appraisal while Amelia's eyes sparkled at the statement. The loud sound of the house door being shut dispelled the atmosphere, though, with Gareth hobbling out towards them with a gangly youth. The boy who had been described as half a man was near full grown, perhaps 1 or 2 years from being considered an adult. He had a similar enough appearance to the lumber merchant, though the boy was still all arms and legs. Upon seeing the group of women, he kept looking back and forth while blushing vividly. His father seemed to have the right idea about what would entice him to leave their home. Sorry for the wait. Gareth held up a small block of wood that appeared to be a stamp. I'll just stamp that there and you can head over to the guild for your payment. Thank you, Ludmilla said as she received the stamped invoice. Do you know which merchant guild branches are still doing business? That's a good question. The lumber merchant scratched his chin. Your best bet is probably the head office in the main plaza. You should get the rest of your inventory settled first though, so you can get paid out all at once. That seems reasonable enough. Right. It'll be a bit to offload your cargo, so you might want to check out some of the shops nearby. Ah, what am I saying? No one's open. Gareth turned and shouted, Boy! Quit your gawking and roll out the gantry. Gareth's boy jumped at his father's voice, blinking a few times before pointing to the ground at the log piles. After seeing all the cargo neatly laid on the ground, the older merchant swung around, looking back and forth between the women in the yard. How the? My footman offloaded the cargo while you were in the house. Ludmilla explained as she directed the soul eater to take the wagon back out of the yard. They are back out of the alley now. Footmen strong enough to carry logs like that, huh? Retired adventurers? Well, you ladies would want at least that much to feel safe traveling around the city, I suppose. While their attendants filed out with the wagon as it left the yard, Ludmilla remained to ask a question. I will probably return with more timber, she said to the lumber merchant. Will you be available to do business in the near future? Humph, Gareth grunted. If what the lady here says is true, it'll be a seller's market soon enough. But yes, I'll be here if you need me. I will be sure to drop by again. Ludmilla paused. By the way, what happened with your leg? Have you had the priests take a look at it? Nah, it's an old injury, back from when I was a lumberjack. His tone was dismissive as he replied. Damn tree fell the wrong way for no reason, must have gotten on the bad side of a damn dryad or something. I was too stubborn to go back to town and have a priest look at it, and my leg ended up healing funny. That's how I ended up in this business. Priests said there's nothing to be done about it after I finally did get around to visiting a temple. Ludmilla looked to Lady Shultier. Is that true, my lady? She asked. No, the cleric replied. You saying the priests lied, lady? Gareth frowned and narrowed his eyes. Probably not on purpose, no. Let's just say the solution would be what you consider inhuman. Gareth had a sour expression on his face. He shifted his weight around several times before speaking again. Out with it then, lady. How can the priests fix my leg after it's already been healed up? They can destroy your leg, Lady Shiltier's words came out simply, and regenerate a new one. Both Gareth and his boy blanched at the casually offered solution. "That's some evil thing you're saying, lady," the lumber merchant said in subdued tones. "From a certain point of view, I suppose." Lady Shaltir smiled slightly. If an ally loses a limb in the heat of combat, a cleric would most certainly act to heal their injuries, if it was within their capacity to do so. She pointed her finger at Gareth's leg. "You were injured," she told him. "If nothing is done, you will carry that injury with you for the rest of your life. Should your priests not endeavor to relieve you of your hardship? Or is your suffering such a good thing that it would be evil to relinquish you of it?" The lumber merchant stared at the point of Lady Shaltir's finger, wrapped in its white silken glove, for a long while. He swallowed loudly before speaking again. "I'll see what the priests have to say," he said. "You do that. I would be most interested in hearing their answer." Lady Shaltir turned to exit the lumber yard and Ludmilla followed after her, leaving Gareth Boyce alone in the yard with his boy. The wagon rumbled down the street while Ludmilla looked through her lumber invoice, re-evaluating the calculations that she had made for the development of her domain. The dramatic difference between the figures she thought she would have to work with and the actual market value of her goods forced her to rethink all of her budgeting. She no longer needed to worry about being able to afford all the tools her labor required, nor the various parts and supplies that the village required to stay in one piece. Provided she could secure everything that was needed, her schedule had advanced considerably and, if the projected results of the undead labor were to be believed, she would need to find a large number of tenants to move into her fief soon. The imp from the lumber yard had lost its ghostly image and was now perched on a rail of the wagon, looking over her shoulder at the papers in her hands. Lady Shaltir broke the silence that had hung over the entourage since they departed the lumber yard. "Say, was my idea really that bad?" she asked. "No, my lady," Ludmilla replied as she continued thinking about her budget. "Then you'd have taken me up on my offer?" "Yes, if I was certain that you could do what you claimed, then I would without hesitation." "Why the difference, then?" Lady Shaltir asked. Ludmilla lowered the page, looking to her liege sitting next to her. If she were perfectly honest with herself, she didn't really know how the subjects of the inner territories conducted their lives, or how they reacted to the world around them. She could only relate her thoughts in terms of her own life on the border, and guess how others might be different. "This is probably not unique to me," she answered. "Anyone that is accustomed to a life where they need to obtain every advantage to survive would probably accept your solution. On the southern frontier, we are constantly under threat by our neighbors in the wilderness. Ambushes and raids can happen with little to no warning. If we turned down the offer to heal an injury that made us unable to fight properly, it could not mean just our own deaths, but the failure to perform our duties to their utmost and the loss of those we care about. Losses that we might have prevented had we been whole." She looked down the street, at the long lane with its shuttered buildings to either side. Even with most of the daylight hours gone, there had not been any sign of life beyond the rows of smoking chimneys and the barely perceptible sense of meals come and gone. A patrol of death knights stomped by, heading in the opposite direction but, aside from the undead, the streets remained empty. In the stability of the towns and cities of secure and developed lands, if you fail at something, if it doesn't get you killed, you can try something else. When some doors close, others open. As long as you have something others value, you can find a place for yourself. Perhaps choices presented before you are the right ones, and turning away from them results in a lifetime of regret. Or it could be that said choices are rash, but your failures in them help you find greater success elsewhere. Because there are always options, men like Gareth Boyce can exist. Putting off the treatment of his injury led to him becoming a successful merchant in the first place. Success can lead to further success, but that same success can also turn you from making decisions that might have actually been for the best, even if it is an obvious decision for others. Then how do you humans find the right path? Lady Shaltir frowned at Ludmilla's words. "I cannot fathom this sort of transient and aimless existence, devoid of inherent purpose." "We do not know which paths are ultimately right, my lady," Ludmilla replied. "We just end up where we are because that is where the choices of our lives lead us, for good or for ill. Thinking there is some perfect path that you are destined for and waiting for it to appear in front of you is a fantasy for fools. You seem to be doing well enough for yourself now." "I was born a noble, my lady. I had very little in the way of choices in that sense. I just happen to find my place quite enjoyable and fulfilling, but I still have no idea about whether it is the right path or not." Ludmilla smirked. "I have many choices that I must make from now on. You can ask whether they were right or not at the end of my life, which hopefully will not come anytime soon." Lady Sheltier wrinkled her nose, but it was probably not at Ludmilla's reply. Odors were carried on the wind as they turned northwards, filling the air with a multitude of different scents. As the wagon proceeded, the scents became stronger, some eye-watering as they wafted by. They occasionally passed buildings of odd construction, fashioned for the manufacture of potions, ointments and oils. Most of the alchemists of the city were located in this loose area in order to keep the emissions of their craft from permeating throughout all of Erantal. The wind would blow the fumes produced by their work over the wall nearby, conveniently into the huge cemetery which occupied the western quarter of the military district. The wagon rolled to a stop at a building with windows that faced westwards towards the afternoon sun. The curtains inside were drawn, but the store itself did not appear to be closed. Ludmilla had issued orders to the Soul Eater as an experiment when they were in the alley outside Gareth Boyce's lumberyard, to head to the alchemist's area and find a shop that had someone working inside. That they had stopped in front of a building with a sign with the words Linez written over it in garishly bright lettering seemed to suggest that her instructions had worked unerringly well. She wondered if the Soul Eater already knew where to go in advance, or if it used some strange sense to carry out its instructions. Amelia went ahead to the workshop door and held the entrance open for the others to pass through. A wave of heat billowed over them, carrying with it the overpowering odor of far too many fragrances overlapping one another. At the long glass counter along the aisle leading into the store, a young woman who appeared to be in her early 20s reclined in a high-backed stool, facing the row of alchemical burners at the back of the workshop. She had a slovenly appearance, her shoulder-length strawberry blonde hair was matted with sweat, which beaded on her skin as well. Her shirt was unbuttoned and clung to her in various places, and she wore shortened trousers that rode far too high up her thighs. The image conveyed an overheated sensation which made the temperature in the sweltering workshop seem even hotter than it already was. "Oi, welcome," she called out at the sound of the chimes hanging over the door, then turned her head upside down towards them from her reclining position. "Che, if at all possible, could you go back outside and come back in as a group of cute men?" At the rear of the group, Amelia clicked her tongue in disapproval at the expression of disappointment. "Just kidding." The woman inside raised her hands, also upside down, disarmingly. "It was a joke, a joke." She straightened in her seat, spinning it to face the counter whilst buttoning up her shirt. It did not improve her sweat-soaked image much. "Gods, I was such a dumbass building an alchemist's workshop with a west-facing storefront. Heat's even worse in the summer, you know." She tied her hair in a loose ponytail as she rambled on. "Anyways, what can I do for you girls, ladies? I know it's spring and all, but the men certainly aren't coming out these days, no matter what scent you wear." "You are the owner of this workshop, Miss Linez?" Ludmilla asked. "Yep, that's me," she nodded. "Germaine Linez, fashioner of fragrances both sweet and seductive." "Well, Maine is fine. I used Linez on the sign since it looks trendier, if you know what I mean, Tilda. Why not just cool the place down by opening the door and windows?" Ludmilla asked. "Ah ha ha, yeah, right. Everyone downwind would come and burn my place to the ground." "I see. We are here to sell sandalwood," Ludmilla said. "Oh, sandalwood. That's pretty rare around these parts. What do you have?" Trees? I am not sure how to describe it." Germaine slid off of her chair, slippers slapping lightly on the floor. She walked over to where a thin coat hung, snatching it off of its peg and throwing it on as she headed back the other way to come out from behind the counter. "That sounds crazy," she said, "but let's take a look." She made her way past them, pushing the door open, then she froze. "Holy crap!" Germaine's voice reverberated over the rooftops. It was somehow much louder than Gareth Boyce shouting for his son. The perfumer closed the door and turned around, facing the other women. There's undead outside," she said in a low voice. "Were they there when you got here? Can I tell them to go away? Should I acid cone them? I think I got just the right angle to hit them all at once from here." "That's not the usual reaction," Lady Sheltier observed. "They just up and parked in front of my shop. Jermaine complained, "There's no way any customers will come in like that. They're not going to run away just because you spray them," Lady Sheltier told her. "Oh, you sure know your stuff, miss." "Sorceress? Cleric?" "Ha, could have fooled me." The perfumer opened the door a crack, peeking outside. "Well, it usually works. Whenever I get nasty folks showing up for whatever reason, I just start casting and they make themselves scarce real quick. Except for that one stupid militia inspector. City made me pay for his healing on top of the fine." "Why did an inspection officer come to see you?" Ludmilla wasn't sure if she wanted to know the answer. "I was trying to air out the place," Jermaine said, turning back to speak to them. "Was the middle of summer and hot as hell. I just couldn't stand it anymore. The neighbors all started complaining about the fumes and this guy just came up all snooty-like and ordered me to close up." "What happened then?" Lady Sheltier asked. "Well, I was really cranky from everything so I just pointed and sprayed." Jermaine pointed her finger out the crack in the door. His face melted right off. So did his arms. Maybe one of his legs? Fell into a puddle of his own goop with his goons shouting bloody murder while dumping their healing potions on him. "How did they not imprison you for that?" Ludmilla was shocked. "Oh, they were hopping mad," Jermaine grinned, "but when you can melt a giant hole in the prison wall that's definitely more trouble than it's worth. Got slapped with a big fat fine but they never came back after that." The perfumer tilted her head at her own words. "I guess it did work, now that I think about it." Ludmilla was beginning to draw some similarities between the people she had met so far that weathered the presence of the undead, but she felt that coming to any immediate conclusions would have lasting effects on her own ego. "The undead outside are with us," she said after clearing her throat. "The wagon in front of the shop is hauling my cargo." "That so?" Jermaine glanced out the door again. "They won't steal my soul or bite me or say hurtful things, will they? The order of severity seems backwards but, no, they will not. You've probably just never fought a banshee. Well, what's the hold-up then?" Jermaine brightened immediately. "I'm dying to get some fresh air." She turned and walked out of the door without a shred of hesitation or shame. After they filed back out of the shop, Ludmilla found the perfumer standing on the wagon bed, repeatedly tugging on her shirt to cool herself. "Ah, so good," Jermaine sighed in contentment. "One of these days I'll get a whole stack of those magical cooling boxes that they sell in the Empire to make my shop livable in the summer." If she showed any sign of self-consciousness as she stood in the breeze, she did not show it. She stretched and fanned her shirt and took her time adjusting her shorts before she held out her hand and cast a spell. Appraisal magic item. "That's not supposed to work on non-magical items," Lady Sheltier said suspiciously. "Ah ha ha, you're right, Miss Cleric." The perfumer knelt to take a closer look at the sandalwood trees. "Sure impresses the heck out of anyone that doesn't know that, though. But it'll drain your mana, won't it?" "I've got mana if you've got coin." Jermaine's voice floated over the edge of the wagon. Not a minute passed before she stood up again. "Yup, they're the real deal." Jermaine cradled her chin thoughtfully with one hand. "These don't grow around here though. How'd you come across 2 whole sandalwood trees older than everyone here combined?" "They are from my domain, I think," Ludmilla replied. "The rangers floated them down the river to the village from wherever they found them." "Your domain?" "Baron Zaradnik was a man, last I checked." "You knew my lord father?" "Nope," the perfumer replied. "But Warden's Vale is the only territory even remotely close to where these grow. Those rangers of yours must have ranged pretty far south to run into these, Baroness." "I was not on the patrol that found them," Ludmilla said, "so I am unsure where exactly they went." "A shame." Jermaine let out her breath in a huff. "There's a lot of good stuff out there, but it's teeming with nasties." The perfumer turned around to look through the rest of the wagon. "What about the rest here?" she asked. "Got anything for me?" "It is all food," Ludmilla answered. "Manna grass, watercress, arrowhead tubers. All nice produce. If I was in the market for produce, the stuff they've been dishing out of the city warehouse has been getting pretty boring lately. Not that I mind free food. Was hoping you had alchemical herbs or something. Ever since the bears moved out to Carney it felt like half of the incoming shipments were going straight to them." "The city has a potion shortage?" "The city is going to have an everything shortage soon." Jermaine walked to the edge of the wagon bed. Once whoever is running things in Central decides enough is enough and chases everyone out of their houses, they're gonna find that all of their supply chains are in shambles. I don't think anything has really come in or gone out since midwinter. No traders, nothing from the duchy, nada. Ludmilla exchanged glances with Lady Sholtier. How many people do you think realize this? Ludmilla asked. Everyone that does business seriously in this city probably does, the perfumer said, but there's not much most can do. Erantal is the biggest trading hub in the nearby region, but we're set up to receive all of the merchant traffic coming through here, not the other way around. There are only a handful of merchant companies based out of the city, and they're mostly owned by nobles who may or may not still be around. Once people come out of their hidey holes, they're gonna find that there are no materials or products to handle, no work, no food. Even the adventurers are going to be in trouble. Most of their jobs here came from keeping Katsa from being more uppity than the surrounding countries would like, but I'm not sure if our sorcerer king would even care that there's a handful more undead wandering around. They'd probably just walk right in through the front gate and sign up for his army. Germaine hopped off the back of the wagon, rubbing her hands together with relish. So, Lady Zaradnik, she said, how would you like to settle this? Due to the current shortfalls, I've got plenty of capacity to extract the oil out of these trees. I can sell some to a jeweler I know as well. He'd love to turn such high-quality sandalwood into fragrant ornaments and the like. Maybe you'll end up buying a few? Gods know you'll be living large after this. How much are we talking about here? Ludmilla was wary after the revelation from Gareth Boyce. Well, Germaine turned back to look at the wagon. These 2 trees should yield around 2 liters of the highest quality oil. That's enough to make incense of a caliber that even a theocracy can't easily get their hands on for every one of their temples, or half a year's worth of perfume for every single noble in one of the big marches. I'll probably be slowly doling it out over time to make sure I get the most out of it. The parts that I don't use I can easily find a buyer for. I can take that off your hands and sell it for you if you don't mind a small surcharge for my time and connections. I do not mind, Ludmilla said, as long as it is not unreasonable. Right then, the perfumer smiled. All said and done it should come out to 96 platinum coins. Is that the right amount? Ludmilla's voice felt very small when it came out. Germaine scratched her head, should be. The finished products are worth more of course. After all the overhead is accounted for, it should leave me with a small margin, as long as I can manage the products properly. Maybe I can finally go out and get a few of those cooling boxes I was talking about. Germaine cackled. She seemed more excited about the future improvement to her comfort than the fact that she was about to part with nearly 100 platinum coins. Actually, she added, before we sign off on this, is there anything you'd like to purchase from my shop? You are a pretty shrewd merchant. Surely you jest, Baroness, Germaine laughed. Any good merchant would do at least this. You never know what people want until you ask, after all. Might even be rendering a service by showing your customers things that they never knew that they needed. Still, having 96 platinum coins available to make purchases with is incredible. I don't actually have that much, personally, but the guild knows how much these are worth and will help finance the trade. Lutzi, Ludmilla called to her maid, who stepped forward with hands folded in front of her. Yes, my lady, Amelia replied. Put together a full inventory of her merchandise that we will need for the city manor, she told her, as well as for the manor staff. I will be having Terra fill the role of interim housekeeper to hire suitable personnel to work there. Yes, my lady. Also a smaller set for various official functions. Yes, my lady. Bring Lady Sholtier's attendants with you as well, Ludmilla added. Maybe they will find something to her liking. Amelia curtsied before she and the vampire brides turned and followed Germaine back into her workshop.